This is a follow-up video to another video I shot regarding rhinoplasty in terms of the skin versus the underlying architecture. I was thinking about it and I thought there was a couple contexts in which this video would have relevance. One would be for ethnic rhinoplasty and the second would be revision rhinoplasty in almost any patient of any race. What I'm going to talk to you about is the relationship of the skin to the underlying architecture in terms of an analogy. The metaphor I like to use is that of a tent. If you think about the nose like a tent, then it is the outside structure is like the fabric and the inside is the actual poles. And so the nose has a relationship of outer skin to inner poles. And think about this. In a white rhinoplasty, and most white rhinoplasties, the skin is relatively thin, not every time, but generally thin, and the underlying architecture is generally thick. So when I work with a white rhinoplasty to get the best results is I shave down, shape the cartilage, and then when you have strong poles that you can manipulate and thin skin, you can see the new architecture through the skin. And that's another reason why in white rhinoplasties I rarely put grafts on top of the other architecture, because if I put a big thick pole on top of a thick pole under a thin skin, that pole or that graft can show up over time. I hope that's clear. So I am very careful of using cartilage grafting on top of existing architecture or existing on existing cartilage, because I'm worried that's going to show up under the thin skin envelope. The opposite is very true in the ethnic nose, whether it be, for example, the Hispanic mestizo nose, many African American noses, and many Asian noses. In this context, you have a very thick envelope, or like the tent fabric is very thick. The underlying architecture or the poles themselves are very flimsy. So if I try to make that flimsy inner cartilage more refined and smaller, what happens is that the fabric on top is actually, you can't see anything. It's all underneath all that. In fact, not only can you not see the changes you've created more of a problem, because now you've created more of a dead space between the tent pole and that's now become smaller and this huge skin envelope on top of it. So that's a problem. So the way that I handle this in most ethnic noses is I restructure the tent pole by using cartilage grafting to push that forward into the thick skin so you can see it. That way you don't create a dead space and you create a stronger tent pole under this thick envelope. And sometimes, like for example right here in some Hispanic or Asian noses, I'll thin down the skin. I'll actually thin down the outer envelope so that you can see the changes that occur. And what's so very important in almost any rhinoplasty, but specifically for ethnic rhinoplasties, is a lot of taping so that the thick skin sits down on the new architecture and so that you can actually see those changes that occur over time. So the final point I want to address is what happens for a rhinoplasty over a period of many years. There can be subtle changes that occur after rhinoplasty, 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out. And really, if you can remember one thing, it's a fight against scar contracture. Essentially what happens is the outer skin envelope shrinks on top of the cartilage grafts. So unfortunately, I think a lot of revision rhinoplasty is all about creating new architecture. But if you create more architecture, thicker architecture, or thicker poles under already thinned out skin, I think you're going to, over a period of 2 to 5 years, show up that architecture again over time. So what I think about when I see a revision rhinoplasty is that fight of scar contracture, where that person is in terms of time after a rhinoplasty, but more specifically, how does that skin envelope relate to the underlying architecture? Is it my goal to create more underlying architecture, which I'm afraid that it potentially could show up over time, or is my goal to slightly thicken the skin envelope? And oftentimes what I'm doing is either some silicone microdroplets, that's only if you're not going to have a major revision nose, is to put a little bit of silicone microdroplets or another type of injectable to try to raise the skin envelope thicker, because I really fear that just putting new architecture, new cartilage grafts underneath very thin skin may look good for about 6 months to a year, but over time, again, that starts to shrink or wrap around this new framework. So if you think about how scar contracture affects everything, and using the analogy of the tent pole, of the poles in the fabric, you can understand how I look at a nose, which is not just about the underlying architecture, it's the relationship of the underlying tent poles to the overlying fabric that matters so very much.